Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and we are continuing my examination and refutation of Lance Conley's book, Hope Resurrected. Now, I've already spent two or three videos on examining Mr. Conley's attempt to negate the time statements of the New Testament. He is using material that he says he personally edited and therefore approved, and Mr. Palmer approved of his editing, in which Mr. Palmer ostensibly examined virtually all, maybe not every single one of them, but the majority at least of the uses of the Greek word mellow. Now, it's really fascinating to me that Mr. Palmer / Mr. Conley would seek to focus on the Greek word mellow and not do a word study of the numerous other temporal words that are used that indicate imminence in the New Testament. Instead, they pick on, as it were, the word mellow. It's used 110 times in the New Testament, and Mr. Palmer / Conley's argument is, well, mellow indicates certainty, not imminence. Well, wait, it can indicate imminence when it's not in a prophetic text. Now, you will seldom find a more arbitrary, capricious, or illogical, and unsupported claim. I have challenged Mr. Conley, and thus I challenge Mr. Palmer, to show us the lexical definition that he imposes on the Greek word mellow. Now remember, Mr. Conley claims that yes, time statements of imminence in the New Testament, when they're speaking about mundane, non-prophetic, non-eschatological tenets, yeah, they absolutely do mean true, genuine imminence. However, he tells us, when time statements are used of eschatological events, they don't mean what they normally do. Now, I'm still waiting on documentation for that. Some proper documentation from the lexicons, from the critical scholars, who are not trying to defend their futurism, but from a purely linguistic, purely grammatical perspective to show us where mellow or time statements, other time statements, when used of non-eschatological elements, refers to nearness of occurrence, but when speaking of eschatological elements, they do not mean imminence. Folks, you're not going to find that definition in any lexicon. You're going to find commentators who struggle with the language. You're going to find commentators who openly admit, well, here's what the word mellow means. It means about to be on the point of, but we all know it didn't happen then. Yeah, you find that a lot. They don't deny the imminence of the word mellow contained in the word. They just struggle to explain it. Now, I don't want to make another 23-minute video. Really, there's no need to. Now, remember what I've shared with you, okay? I've shared with you that if even one New Testament time statement concerning the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, the end of the age, can be demonstrated to convey and to communicate genuine objective imminence, then Mr. Conley's entire book goes down the drain. Now, I've already illustrated that. I've already proven that by an examination of the passages that he even adduces. But let me pick up on that on page 76 and following, where he picks up on Matthew 16:27. Jesus said in Matthew 16:26 and 27, the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels and shall reward every man according to his works. And verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, Mr. Conley says, Matthew 16:27, the Son of Man shall, is often contended to either refer to the transfiguration, the ascension, or the destruction of Jerusalem. Now notice that he admits the possibility that it applies to the fall of Jerusalem. Now, he goes ahead. I have to tell you that the entire extremely long paragraph on page 76 is one of the most confusing paragraphs I have ever read. And I'm not trying to be nitpicky. I'm just simply saying I've read it 4 times, trying to make good sense out of it. The grammatical construction is bad, as the rest of the book is. But he makes a claim, and I'll try to convey this to you. And he says, these events, the language like Matthew 16, 27, 28. He said, these events, panoramically and historically scoped, sometimes lasting hundreds of years, as did so in the offenses made against the church, because of their solidarity to the unknown God of the known world, instead of a forced theological allegiance towards the Roman emperors, in a temporal space and time in which it would be better to lose your life for Christ rather than to gain it. Now that's all one sentence. And again, I've read that 4 times. And it still is not coherent. Now, what Mr. Conley is trying to say is that Matthew 16, 27 and 28 could be the transfiguration. It could be the resurrection of Christ, the ascension of Christ, or the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, let's see. Matthew 16, 27 is the coming of Christ in judgment. Well, guess what? Christ didn't come in judgment at the Mount of Transfiguration 6 days later. Point number 2, Christ did not come in judgment at his ascension. But Matthew 16, 27 is the coming of Christ with his angels in judgment and the reward of every man. So, yeah, I'm very, very aware that scholars have struggled with the language of Matthew 16, 27 because they know it was going to happen in that generation. And by the way, right in the middle of this paragraph, Mr. Conley says, too often do we see this in history from the time of the apostolic generation. I think it's interesting that he uses apostolic generation to refer to a period of time in contrast to Mr. Frost, who is now saying this generation means this kind of people. 2 radically different definitions from 2 different opponents of covenant eschatology. But I want you to notice, once again, Matthew 16, 27 is the coming of Christ with his angels in judgment. It is not a vision of his coming, it is his coming in judgment. Point number 2, that coming would be before that entire generation passed away. Now here's what you need to know. In the parallel passage of Mark chapter 8 and chapter 9 verse 1, we are told that there was a great multitude present. Now, Jesus said, there are some standing here. Some means only some, and it means most won't, but some will live to see this event. Okay? Now, Mr. Conley says, well, that prediction entails the transfiguration possibly. Are we supposed to believe that out of that great multitude of people that was there, only some lived for the next 6 days? You see, folks, that doesn't even make good nonsense. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 1 to 5 and following, Paul speaks of the appearances of Christ, and he says Christ was seen of 500 men at one time. Now remember, Paul is writing here in the mid-50s. So he's writing over 20 years after the fact. And he says Christ had been seen after his resurrection of over 500 brethren at one time. And notice what he says, of whom the greater part remain alive until now. So the greater part of the 500 lived for 25 years, a quarter of a century. But according to the view that Matthew 16, 27, 28 refers to the transfiguration, only part of the great multitude, which would be more than 500, only a few of them lived for the next 7 days or 6 days. You see, it doesn't even make good nonsense. Now, then Mr. Conley makes this amazing comment in regard to that language. There are some standing here, and in parentheses, he says, of note, the some shall not taste death, unquote, could simply be a reference to Judas, who would not see the resurrection or the ascension when Christ would see him come into his kingdom. Well, in the first place, that's an extremely confusing and confused sentence. Christ wasn't going to see Judas come in the kingdom. And yet, that's what Mr. Conley's own words say. But notice that Jesus said, some standing here will not die until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, folks, that's a temporal statement. It is a delimiting statement that his coming in judgment, in the kingdom, with his angels, and in reward was going to be in that generation. That is a time statement of imminence that cannot be denied. Now watch this. Once again, Jesus said, some standing here will not die. Mr. Conley says, the some shall not taste death could simply be a reference to Judas, who would not live to see the resurrection or the ascension. Mr. Conley turns Jesus' words upside down, inside out, absolutely turns them on their head. Jesus did not say, one of you will not live to see the resurrection or the ascension. Jesus didn't say that. He said, some standing here will see the coming of the Son of Man. Not one of you will die. And then I really honestly have no idea what is meant by this statement. The some shall not taste death could simply be a reference to Judas, who would not see the resurrection nor the ascension when Christ would see him come into his kingdom. I don't know what that means. Now, Mr. Conley says he edited this, and Mr. Palmer approved of this. And yet, that parenthetical statement literally makes no sense. It makes no grammatical, it makes no linguistic, it makes no journalistic sense whatsoever. It is confused and confusing and false as can be. Now, very, very quickly, he admits that Matthew 16:27 predicts the vindication of the saints, along with Jesus' vindication. I agree with that comment. When did Jesus say, all of the blood of all the righteous shed on the earth from creation onward would be vindicated? Matthew 23. This generation shall by no means pass until all of these things come to pass. Or all of these things shall come upon this generation. So, in essence, Mr. Conley is admitting that since Matthew 16:27 and 28 is a prediction of the vindication of the suffering of his saints along with his own personal vindication, then guess what? Since Matthew 23 puts the vindication of all of the martyrs at the judgment of Jerusalem in AD 70, that means Matthew 16:27, 28 was fulfilled in AD 70. Well, look, I could go on, but what I have presented to you so far really is more than enough. I have demonstrated to you the abuse of the language that Mr. Conley and Mr. Palmer engage in. They arbitrarily say, and look, I could keep on going here, in one passage after another, they say, well, yeah, there's an indication of surety, not time. Surety and certainty, not denoting a simple time indicator. Well, let's see, Matthew 17, verse 12 and verse 22. The Son of Man, New King James rendering, the Son of Man is about to be betrayed, to suffer, and to be crucified. Translators sure thought it was an indication of imminence. And if it's not an indication of imminence, could Jesus be talking about a yet future, far off, hundreds of years, thousands of years suffering of the Son of Man? Or was he talking about his suffering that was to occur, within a matter of months? Yeah, literally about to suffer. But that shows you how arbitrary, how inconsistently Mr. Conley and Mr. Palmer render the Greek word mellow. And once again, ignoring the entire rest of the vocabulary of time statements to be found in the New Testament. They seem to be arguing, well, if we can show that mellow doesn't indicate imminence, we've destroyed all time statements. That didn't even come close. That's illogical. Makes no sense whatsoever. And the point of fact is, as I've demonstrated, number one, they're inconsistent in their rendering of mellow. Number two, mellow does indicate imminence, as Matthew 16, 27 and 28 points out. It was to be fulfilled in that generation. Thus, as I have shared, if there's even one New Testament time statement that conveys and communicates objective nearness, objective imminence of the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, the kingdom, then Mr. Conley's entire book is false. Every bit of it. I have demonstrated to you, I haven't even presented a sliver of all of the evidence, but I've demonstrated to you the New Testament does objectively, irrefutably indicate the imminence of the coming of the Lord with his angels in judgment, in the kingdom, in the first century, in the lifetime of the first century generation. Now look, I've been offering to you my book, Who is This Babylon?, which has an extensive study of the time statements of the New Testament, as well as my book, Can God Tell Time? Well, I want to offer now, a little bit of a shift here. Not only my book, Who is This Babylon?, but Can You Believe Jesus Said This?, which is an in-depth examination of Matthew 16, 27 and 28, in which I answer every quibble, every argument that has been made that I'm aware of, at the time of the writing of this, every argument that has been given to negate the force of the text in which Jesus predicted his coming with the angels in judgment, in the kingdom, in that generation. So, regularly $19.95 plus $4.95 shipping, regularly $2.95 plus $4.95 shipping, Your total delivered price for U.S. orders only, $19.95. So go to my website, donkpreston.com, order the books, order them independently and separately. I'll refund your shipping. But you got to mention you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook. Thanks so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. You have a fantastic and safe weekend. I'll see you on Monday.